A crumpled note, written in pencil, dated June 5th, 1944. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all the bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Dwight Eisenhower wrote those words, folded the note, slid it into his wallet. Then he climbed into a staff car and drove to Greenham Common Airfield in the English dark and watched 12,000 paratroopers board their planes. He had already received the letter, the one from Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, head of Allied Expeditionary Air Forces, among the most senior British officers in the coalition, warning Eisenhower, in clinical military language, that the airborne drop was an operation bordering on the foolhardy, that it would result in futile slaughter of 2 fine divisions, that the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe was, in the careful judgment of his own coalition partner, about to commit the worst mistake of the war. Eisenhower read it. He sat with it for hours. He wrote back to Lee Mallory, acknowledging the risk. Then he gave the order anyway. 12,000 men flew into the dark over Normandy that night. The 82nd Airborne, the 101st, into anti-aircraft fire. Into flooded fields the German engineers had deliberately inundated. Into a drop zone where German reserves had been quietly repositioned, reserves that British aerial reconnaissance had failed to detect. Here is the question. What kind of man does that? What kind of commander sends 12,000 soldiers into darkness after his own senior partners call it reckless, foolish, and wrong? By the time you finish this story, you will know exactly what kind of man, because you will see what happened when his army's plan fell apart and what he had built to survive it. June 5th, 1944. Greenham Common Airfield, Berkshire, England. 2100 hours. The paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, were painting their faces black and checking their equipment for the 3rd time that evening. Because paratroopers always check their equipment a 3rd time. And because a buckle missed means a man dead. And because checking gives the hands something to do while the mind runs calculations, it cannot stop. Among them was Staff Sergeant Raymond Alcott, age 26, of Abilene, Kansas. The choice of hometown is not incidental. Abilene, Kansas, the same town that produced Dwight David Eisenhower. Alcott had grown up 2 streets from the house where Eisenhower was born, had gone to the same school Eisenhower had attended decades earlier, and had, in the manner of small American towns, absorbed a specific kind of self-reliance that both men wore like a second skin. Alcott carried a photograph in his breast pocket, not of a girl, not of his mother, but of his father's hardware store on Buckeye Street. He told his squad it was a reminder of what normal looked like. What he was actually carrying was a promise to come back and sweep the floor. His squad was 6 men by June 5th, down from its original 9. Private First Class Marcus Webb, 20, from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who had never fired a weapon before joining the Army and was now widely considered the best shot in the platoon. Corporal Darnell Price, 22, from Chicago, who had been denied entry to officer candidate school twice on grounds that had nothing to do with his scores. Private Eugene Schacht, 19, from Duluth, Minnesota, who had told the recruiting sergeant he was 21 and had been lying about his age for so long he sometimes forgot the truth himself. And Technical Sergeant Harold Hatcher, 31, from Philadelphia, who had fought in North Africa and Sicily and who knew things about combat that could not be written in a field manual. And the mission was this: the 505th PIR would drop into the Mer de Ré River Valley in Normandy before dawn on June 6, 1944, and seize the causeway at La Fière, a narrow stone bridge over the Mer de Ré, connecting the Cotentin Peninsula's interior to the main road network running toward Cherbourg. Whoever held La Fière controlled the only practical route for German armor to reinforce the Atlantic Wall defenses against the seaborne landings at Utah Beach. Schaft's planners had been explicit. If German tanks reached Utah Beach in the first 12 hours, the landing would fail. La Fière was the plug in the drain. The plan, as Schaft designed it, was elegant. The 505th would drop intact, consolidate within 2 hours, and hold the causeway until relieved by forces pushing inland from Utah. Simple, documented, mapped. And the flaw that the maps at headquarters could not show was the water. The Germans had spent the previous winter opening the floodgates on the Mer de Ré River, deliberately inundating the fields on either side of the causeway. What the aerial reconnaissance photographs showed as flat green pasture was, on the ground, a marsh between 1 and 4 feet deep, invisible from above, impassable for vehicles, and a death trap for paratroopers landing in the dark. Schaft's planners had identified the general flooding, but had underestimated its extent by a factor that would only become apparent when men began drowning in their harnesses in the dark. Alcott didn't know this yet. What he did know, because it had been briefed, because it was in the operation order, was Eisenhower's command philosophy. Every officer and NCO trained under Schaft had been drilled in 2 principles that Eisenhower had made foundational: initiative within intent, meaning that if the plan failed, the mission did not. You knew the commander's goal. You found another way to reach it. And logistics is strategy, meaning that the side that could sustain operations, that could feed ammunition, fuel, and men into a fight while the enemy ran dry, would win regardless of initial tactical success or failure. Alcott had written those 2 principles in his notebook during the briefing at Quorn, Leicestershire, on June 2, 1944. He wrote, "If the plan is broken, the goal is not." He did not know he would need those words in approximately 14 hours. And on the other side of the English Channel, and in the headquarters of the German 91st Infantry Division, near Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, the intelligence officer had just delivered his evening briefing. He noted increased Allied air activity and radio traffic consistent with an imminent operation. He recommended heightened readiness. His commander, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falley, listened politely and then observed that the Allies had been manufacturing imminent operations for 3 months without delivering one. He noted that Eisenhower, the American political general, the man who had spent most of his career pushing paper in Washington, had never commanded a battlefield. He noted that the British and Americans had already proven, in Italy, that they could not coordinate a coalition force under pressure. He said, and this was recorded by his aide and survived in post-war German documents, that he did not fear an American airborne operation because an army built by an administrator cannot move like one built by a soldier. Falley ordered a war game for his senior staff. They would simulate an Allied invasion the following morning. Then he went to bed. He would be dead within 6 hours, killed in an ambush on the road to Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, as paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne dropped around his headquarters in the dark. But that is a different story. This story is about La Fière, and it begins with Alcott's parachute snapping open at 1:15 on June 6, 1944, and everything going immediately, catastrophically wrong. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes, free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. Now, back in the video. The first thing Staff Sergeant Raymond Alcott felt when he hit the murderette was not water. It was the absence of ground. His boots found nothing, no resistance, no solid earth. And he went in past his ankles, past his knees, and then the chute caught the wind and began dragging him sideways through a flooded field in absolute darkness, while German anti-aircraft tracers lit the sky orange above him. He got the chute collapsed in 45 seconds. He had practiced it. He needed 30 years' worth of calm to do it in the dark, in cold water, with equipment that now weighed twice what it should have. He was alone. The drop had scattered the 505th across 12 miles of flooded Norman countryside. The plan had assumed a consolidated regiment. What existed instead were small groups of men, some 5, some 12, some alone, navigating by compass and memory through flooded fields that matched no map ever drawn, toward an objective that every one of them had memorized, because Eisenhower's army had trained them to memorize it. Alcott found Hatcher first, then Webb. Then, after 40 minutes of movement through thigh-deep water that left both men shaking from cold and exertion, they found Price and Schacht sheltering in a hedgerow near the hamlet of Causeway, 200 meters west of the La Fière causeway. 5 men. Their original 6 had not appeared. Private First Class Tommy Ostrowski, 21, from Detroit, or who had a wife named Helen and a daughter born in April, whom he had never met. Ostrowski had come down in the river itself. He did not come up. Hatcher said nothing. He checked his ammunition. The rest of the men checked theirs. The resistance contact, a French farmer named Gaston Renard, who had been supplying the local maquis with German movement data since 1942, was supposed to meet them at the watermill east of Causeway at 0200. The watermill did not exist. The aerial photograph had been taken in 1938. The mill had been demolished by the Germans in 1943 to improve their sight lines across the causeway approach. This was the first piece of wrong intelligence. The second was worse. The briefing at Quorn had specified that the eastern approach to La Fière causeway was held by a reinforced platoon, approximately 40 German infantry, a dug-in but thinly spread, with no armor support and no artillery within range. The regiment's intelligence officer had gotten this from a French resistance report dated May 20th, 1944. What the report could not account for was that on May 28th, the German 1057th Grenadier Regiment had rotated a full company, 120 men, into the La Fière position, supported by two 75mm anti-tank guns pre-sighted on the causeway itself, and a heavy machine gun position in the stone farmhouse commanding the eastern bank. Alcott didn't know any of this when he led his 5 men through the hedgerow and began moving toward the causeway. He knew something was wrong at about 40 meters out. The hedge line on the eastern bank was wrong, too thick, too regular. Not the profile of natural growth, the profile of men concealed in growth. Webb saw it too, and touched Alcott's arm without making a sound. Alcott had 1 second to raise his fist. The German MG-42 opened at a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, and the hedgerow in front of them disintegrated. The next 6 seconds are almost impossible to reconstruct from the surviving accounts because there were no surviving accounts from that first moment. Only Alcott's own, written 3 weeks later at a field hospital near Sainte-Mère-Église. The sound came before the understanding. My body moved before my mind caught up. I was behind a root mass the size of a car, and I did not know how I had gotten there. Webb made it to cover. Hatcher made it to cover. Price was hit in the left shoulder and went down in the open, and Alcott went back out to get him. Not as a decision, but as a fact that occurred before anything else could, and dragged him behind the root mass while 2 German riflemen adjusted their fire and, shocked, put enough fire into the hedgerow to make them careful. Price was breathing. The wound was bad. He would not be shooting for the rest of the morning. The radio, the SCR-300 that connected them to the regiment, had taken a round through its casing somewhere in the first burst. It produced static and nothing else. Alcott had 5 men. 1 was down. He had no radio. He could not reach the regiment. The objective, the causeway, was held by a force he could now hear assembling in the hedgerows. German NCOs calling positions, the heavy clunk of ammunition being redistributed. A voice somewhere to his right issuing commands in the calm tone of a unit that had known exactly where to wait. This was not a passive defense. This was an ambush. They had known. The radio call, when it came, was not from his radio. It was from Hatcher, who had crawled 30 meters through the water and reached a soldier from the 2nd Battalion, who still had a working set. Through him, Alcott got HQ. What HQ told him made no sense. The regiment's operations officer, working from his position map and the last transmission received 40 minutes ago, told Alcott to pull his element back to the rally point at Amfreville and await consolidation with the main body. New orders. The regiment would assault La Fière as a coordinated force at first light, approximately 0530. It was 0320. First light was 2 hours away. The Germans were actively reinforcing, and in the stone farmhouse on the eastern bank, the one the briefing had described as a possible observation post, Alcott could now see, through the pre-dawn gray, the barrel of a 75mm anti-tank gun being reoriented toward the causeway road. If that gun was in position by first light, a coordinated assault across the causeway would be a massacre. Pull back and wait, or stay and act with 5 men, 1 of them wounded, against a force he could not yet fully count. Think about what that decision weighs. Not in doctrine, in your body, in the dark. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For the men who made that decision in the dark, with no backup and no guarantees, it is the least we can do. Raymond Alcott did not consult a manual. He had, at some point in the previous 18 months of training, absorbed something that Dwight Eisenhower had spent his entire military career trying to build into an institution. The understanding that a plan is a tool, not a contract. That the commander's intent, the goal, outlives the plan. That the man on the ground, the one who can see what the map cannot show, is not a subordinate of the plan. He is the instrument of the intent. This was not abstract doctrine. Eisenhower had written in a staff memorandum at Fière in January 1944. Every soldier must know that if he is cut off, if communications fail, if the plan has broken down around him, his job is not to stop. His job is to think about what his commander needs to have happen, and then make it happen with whatever he has. That memorandum had been distributed through every level of command. Alcott had read it. Hatcher had read it. Every sergeant in the 82nd Airborne had read some version of it in some briefing at some point in the previous year. The doctrine had a name: initiative with an intent. Alcott used it now. He did not pull back to Amfreville. He did not execute the coordinated assault with 5 men, either, which would have been suicidal. He read the terrain. He thought about what the enemy knew and what the enemy did not know, and he thought about the specific arrogance that had left a German company in a fixed defensive position, confident, calling in positions to their own command structure, not looking left. The farmhouse was the key. The 75mm gun was the key. If that gun could be disrupted, not destroyed, not taken, just disrupted, forced to reposition, the coordinated assault at 0530 could cross the causeway before the gun crew recovered. But reaching the farmhouse required crossing ground the German MG position had already zeroed, and reaching it required going through the family that lived there. The farmhouse was not abandoned. Alcott knew this because in the 15 minutes he had been watching it, he had seen movement in a second-floor window, a face, briefly, then gone. A civilian, possibly several civilians. The farm family had not evacuated, whether by choice, German order, or simply the practical impossibility of leaving in the middle of a war. They were in the building where the German gun crew was setting up. Eisenhower's written directive to field commanders in the Normandy campaign had been unambiguous. Civilian lives were a strategic priority, not a moral nicety, a strategic requirement. On causing unnecessary civilian casualties in liberated French territory would destroy the political coalition that made the entire operation possible, would turn the French population from an asset into a liability, and would hand German propaganda a weapon. The directive had teeth. Officers who ordered unnecessary civilian casualties faced court-martial. Alcott had to get that gun crew out of the farmhouse. He could not shell the farmhouse. He could not throw grenades through its windows with a family inside. He could not assault it frontally, not with 4 effective men. He could, however, do the one thing the German defenders had not planned for. He could knock on the back door. The flooding had created something the German position map did not show: a submerged irrigation ditch running along the northern wall of the farm, and invisible from the German MG position because it was below the sight line of the hedgerow. Alcott had mapped it in his head during the firefight, watching how the water moved. It wasn't on any document in German hands. He told Hatcher to keep the MG position occupied. 2 men, intermittent fire, make noise, be seen. He told Schacht to stay with Price and keep him conscious. He told Webb to follow him into the water. Marcus Webb, 20, from Tuscaloosa, wrote to his mother from the hospital at Cherbourg on June 29, 1944. Sergeant Alcott went in that ditch like he'd been practicing it his whole life. Me, I was convinced I was going to die in a French drainage channel, and they'd never find my body. I went in after him anyway. I don't know what else to do when someone moves that sure. It took 22 minutes to navigate the ditch to the farmhouse wall. 22 minutes in cold water, moving silently, while the sound of Hatcher's harassing fire kept the German gun crew's attention oriented east. At the north wall, Alcott came out of the ditch and found what he was looking for. A root cellar entrance, set into the foundation, secured with a wooden bar, but not a lock. Inside, an elderly French woman named Marthe Renard, the wife of the contact who had never appeared, and her 2 grandchildren, ages 7 and 9. They had been in the cellar for 4 hours. Marthe Renard spoke no English. Webb spoke no French. What passed between them in the next 90 seconds was conducted in gestures, in tone, and in the universal human language of one person telling another, "I need you to trust me. Get your children flat. Do not move. Do not make a sound." She understood. She had been waiting for the Americans since 1940. Alcott went up through the cellar into the farmhouse kitchen, Webb behind him. 2 German soldiers, the gun crew's loaders, were at the front window, watching the causeway. The gun itself, the 75 millimeter, was in the barn attached to the farmhouse's eastern wall. They could hear the crew making adjustments. What happened in the farmhouse kitchen is in the official record of the 505th PIR. It took 11 seconds. Both German soldiers were taken without firing a weapon. The gun crew in the barn, hearing nothing, kept working. When Alcott appeared in the barn doorway with Webb beside him, and 4 German soldiers realized their situation, the gun crew made a rational military decision. They raised their hands. It was 0412 on June 6, 1944. If this story has stayed with you, if you want to understand the decisions that shaped the world we live in, this channel needs your subscription to keep telling these stories. Alcott had achieved, with 4 effective men and 0 additional casualties, what no frontal assault could have accomplished. He had not violated civilian safety. He had not followed the order to withdraw. He had followed the intent, the goal, that every layer of Eisenhower's command structure had been built to transmit. Hold that causeway. Keep the German armor off Utah Beach. Do it with whatever you have. He radioed the regiment at 0418. The gun was neutralized. The crossing was possible. He did not know yet that the Germans had one more play. At 0445 on June 6, 1944, the first elements of the 505th PIR's A Company began moving toward La Fière Causeway from the west. They were not a regiment. They were 47 men, scattered survivors of the drop, consolidated by shouting names in the dark across flooded fields. 47 paratroopers against a German company of 120, still in position on the eastern bank, still holding the hedgerows, still with 2 machine guns zeroed on the causeway road. But without the 75 millimeter gun, without the one weapon that would have made the crossing physically impossible. Alcott had his 5 men, 4 now, with Price carried between them. positioned in the farmhouse, covering the German MG position from an angle the Germans had not accounted for in their defensive plan. And he had given the regiment his position and his firing sector. He had done what Eisenhower's system asked him to do, solved the problem he could solve, reported the information he had, and prepared to support the element that would solve the rest. The assault across La Fière causeway began at 0512. 47 men on a stone road 3 meters wide, exposed on both sides to flooded fields, advancing toward a German company in prepared positions. The causeway was approximately 300 meters long. It was, by any standard tactical analysis, an assault with unacceptable odds. It nearly broke in the first 60 seconds. The German MG-42s opened as soon as the lead element reached the midpoint of the causeway. 3 men went down immediately. The column compressed. The natural human instinct was to go flat, to stop, and to find cover that did not exist on a 3-meter wide bridge over a flooded river. The column stopped. From the farmhouse window, Alcott watched the column stop and knew what would happen next. A stopped column on an exposed causeway was a column that would be destroyed in detail. The Germans were already shifting the second MG position to cover the rear of the column. In approximately 90 seconds, they would have both ends of the causeway covered, and the assault would be over. He had 4 magazines left. Webb had 6. The farmhouse position could suppress one of the 2 MG positions, the one in the northern hedgerow, for approximately 45 seconds of continuous fire before they ran dry. 45 seconds. He told Webb to start shooting. He told Hatcher to take Price out the back of the farmhouse and get to A Company's rear element. He picked up the radio. He did not call for air support. Weather had grounded everything south of the English Channel since midnight, the same low cloud ceiling that had scattered the paratroop drop. He did not call for artillery. The nearest Allied artillery was on Utah Beach, 6 miles east, and had no confirmed coordinates for a target this close to friendly troops. He called the A Company commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Alexander, and said 6 words. "We have 45 seconds. Move now." Alexander had 30 years of command training and 4 seconds of available data. He made the only decision that could be made and started running. The column moved, while Alcott and Webb opened fire on the northern hedgerow MG position from a direction and elevation the German crew had not expected. Not from the causeway, not from the west, but from the north, from a farmhouse that was supposed to be in German hands. The crew hesitated. In combat, hesitation is fatal. A crew that hesitates to relocate a weapon dies behind it. The crew relocated. It took them 11 seconds to pick up the MG-42 and begin moving to a new position. In those 11 seconds, 47 paratroopers crossed 40 meters of the deadliest ground on the Cotton Tan Peninsula. Then Alcott's magazine ran dry. The northern MG recovered and found its position. Webb's rifle jammed, mud in the mechanism, the enemy of every weapon in every war. The southern MG position had never been suppressed, and now had the column in its sights again. The column stopped again. 60 meters from the eastern end of the causeway. 2 paratroopers were down on the causeway. One was still moving. One was not. Alcott looked at his remaining equipment with the specific attention of a man who has decided he is going to think rather than panic. He had 1 rifle, 3 rounds remaining in the chamber, 1 phosphorus grenade, and a farmhouse full of captured German equipment he had not yet examined. He examined it now. In the barn, the 75mm anti-tank gun sat intact. Ammunition was stacked beside it, 10 rounds, primers attached. Neither Alcott nor Webb had ever fired a 75mm anti-tank gun. The German gun crew had abandoned it in good working order. Alcott had spent 2 months in North Africa, watching the 1st Infantry Division's artillery. He had, and in the specific way of curious NCOs, in static positions, asked questions. He had not asked enough questions to qualify as a gunner. He had asked enough questions to point a gun and pull a trigger. The gun was oriented south. The German southern MG position was southeast, approximately 200 meters, in a stone barn. The stone barn was, on the German defensive map, well outside any expected Allied indirect fire zone. He loaded the gun incorrectly the first time. Hatcher, back at the farmhouse window, having left Price with the rear element, corrected him. The second round loaded properly. The stone barn took the round at 05:31, 18 minutes into the assault. Stone barns are not bunkers. The southern MG position had 47 seconds of effective life after that round struck. The gun crew got the weapon operating again. I traversed it toward the gun flash from the farmhouse barn, and then the column was over the causeway. Sergeant First Class William Blank, 29, from Canton, Ohio, 505th PIR, wrote in his after-action report, dated June 9th, 1944. When I came over the eastern end of that causeway, I expected to die. What I found instead was a farmhouse with an American sergeant I'd never met, a German anti-tank gun that had been fired twice and was still smoking, and 2 French children sitting in the kitchen eating crackers from a K ration box. I did not know what had happened in that farmhouse. I know what it had cost. There was a look on Alcott's face that I had seen before. You see it on men who have made decisions they will carry. The eastern bank of the Mer d'Arrée at La Fière was secured by 0608 on June 6, 1944. Price survived, and he was evacuated at 7:15, losing the use of his left arm above the elbow. He went home to Chicago in September 1944. He opened a bar on South Michigan Avenue that he ran for 41 years. In the German command post at Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, the duty officer received the report from the La Fière position at 0620 and sent an immediate signal to 91st Division headquarters. The signal described a coordinated attack by a numerically superior American force with artillery support and armored elements. He could not explain, and the signal records show he tried, repeatedly, to explain how a force that had landed in the dark, scattered across 12 miles of flooded terrain, with no vehicles, with no guaranteed radio communication, with no pre-positioned artillery, had taken a fortified causeway in under an hour. And the duty officer wrote, they should not have been able to do this. He was correct. They should not have. The math said they couldn't. The tactical calculus said the position was sound. Eisenhower had spent 4 years making sure the math was wrong. La Fière Causeway, Normandy, France, June 6th, 1944. 700 hours. The smell first. Cordite and river mud, and something else that every veteran of every war knows, and no one writes down, because there is no adequate word for it. The smell of a place where men have just died. The causeway was 30 meters of silence after noise that had lasted for an hour, and the silence was louder than the guns had been. Alcott sat on the eastern bank of the Murderay, with his back against a stone wall, and counted what he had left. 1 serviceable rifle, 7 rounds. Webb beside him, hands shaking in the particular way that hands shake after the body has run on adrenaline and has nothing left to burn. Shacked, alive, unhurt, somewhere behind them with the rear element. Price, gone. Ostrowski, gone. The causeway behind them, in American hands. He did not feel triumphant. Veterans never do, and if you have served, you know why. Because the accounting that comes after is always specific. You count the faces. You count the names. He had a notebook in his jacket, still legible despite the water. He wrote 2 names in it. He would carry those names for the rest of his life. The German assessment of what happened at La Fière causeway. Survived the war. In the records of the 91st Infantry Division, discovered by American historians in the 1960s and partially translated by the U.S. Army Center of Military History. In General Major Bernhard Klosterkemper, who assumed command of the 91st Division after Falley's death on June 6th, wrote in his post-battle analysis of the Cotentin Peninsula fighting, "We had calculated correctly for every variable except one, the American soldiers' capacity to function without a working plan. We had assumed that the disruption of their communications, which was total, and the failure of their drop pattern, which was catastrophic, would produce the paralysis that it would have produced in any force I had commanded. Instead, we faced soldiers who appeared to have been trained for the specific circumstance of the plan failing. This is not a military concept I had encountered before. It is not in the German field manual. It appears to have been built into the American system at a level below the officer corps, into sergeants and corporals. I do not know when they learned it. I know we did not prepare for it." Klosterkemper had, in April of 1944, written a staff appreciation of Allied command capacity that included the judgment that Eisenhower, a man who had never commanded troops in battle, was fundamentally unsuited to supreme command of a coalition force. He had written that Eisenhower's career was that of a staff officer and administrator, and that the coming invasion, if it came, would reveal the fatal gap between Allied organizational theory and German battlefield practice. He did not revise that assessment in writing. But the post-battle analysis speaks for itself. A German division commander, in processing the wreckage of a fortified position that had been held by a squad-sized element of American paratroopers armed with captured equipment and a 75-millimeter gun that neither of them knew how to fire, was searching for language to explain something that his training had given him no framework to describe. Eisenhower had built that framework. Not in the paratroopers themselves, they were extraordinary, but in the system that had trained them, supplied them, equipped them with a doctrine that did not stop when the plan did. The framework was initiative within intent. The framework was logistics as strategy. The framework was the understanding, built into every level of command, that the goal outlives the plan. Eisenhower received the La Fière reports as part of the 82nd Airborne's D-Day after-action assessment in late June 1944. And he had already written to Lee Mallory, the Air Marshal who had warned him the airborne operation was foolhardy, acknowledging that the drop had been badly scattered and that the losses had been severe. What he also noted, and what he later wrote in his memoir, Crusade in Europe, was that the scattered paratroopers had, in many cases, achieved their objectives anyway, not because the plan worked, but because the men inside the plan had been built to function when it didn't. He wrote, "Throughout the Normandy campaign, the resourcefulness and initiative displayed by comparatively junior leaders, often sergeants, was a constant source of profound satisfaction. It was the closest Eisenhower ever came to saying, 'This is exactly what I designed this for.'" Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory wrote to Eisenhower on June 7, 1944, the day after the airborne operation, acknowledging that the results had defied his predictions. He wrote that he was very glad his fears had not been fulfilled. It was the language of a man who had been completely wrong and knew it and was doing his best to be gracious about it. Eisenhower kept the letter. He kept all the letters. He kept the note he had written to himself about the failure that never came. What the British High Command had called reckless was, in the cold accounting of June 6, 1944, the decision that held the entire western flank of Operation Overlord together. Not because everything went according to plan, because nothing went according to plan. And the men Eisenhower had built were ready for that. Raymond Alcott came home to Abilene, Kansas, in November 1945, and he reopened his father's hardware store on Buckeye Street. He never spoke publicly about La Fière. He was not a man given to speeches. He died in 1987 at the age of 69. His obituary in the Abilene Reflector Chronicle noted his military service without detail. The La Fière causeway still stands. It is a narrow stone crossing over the Merdere River, 3 meters wide, unremarkable to anyone who does not know what crossed it in the dark on the morning of June 6, 1944. There is a monument nearby, a bronze paratrooper, larger than life, facing east. His name is Iron Mike, and he has been standing there since 1997. He is looking at the far bank. He is looking at what it cost. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served under Eisenhower's command in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, or the drive into Germany, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What campaign? Where did they end up? Those stories exist in family memory and nowhere else. Share them here. They belong here. The lesson that La Fière teaches, that Eisenhower spent his entire career trying to institutionalize, is not about individual heroism. It is about what an organization can do when it is built around the understanding that the plan will fail, that the map will not match the ground, that communications will go down at the worst moment, that the gap between what headquarters knows and what is happening under your boots is always, always wider than anyone wants to admit. Eisenhower's greatest weapon was not the Sherman tank, not the B-17, not the 12,000 paratroopers flying into Normandy in the dark. His greatest weapon was the system he built around them, a system that did not stop when the plan did, that did not wait for orders that could not come, that knew, at the level of the sergeant carrying a notebook through a Norman irrigation ditch, that the goal outlives the plan. Lee Mallory called it reckless. The German staff called it impossible. The men of the 82nd Airborne called it Tuesday. The causeway is still there. Go see it if you can. If this story has stayed with you, if you want to understand the decisions that shape the world we live in, this channel needs your subscription to keep telling stories like it. This video gives you the story. But the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details. Forgotten heroes free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description.